I was shocked when I saw my boss take off my wife's wedding ring at the company dinner and kiss her. That scene made it clear to me that it was all over, but I decided that I would turn things around in an impeccable way that they would never have imagined, because at that exact moment, while the lights in the room reflected on the crystal glasses and the muffled sound of laughter mixed with the background music, I was dying inside. I felt naked, exposed, as if every glance in that restaurant knew what I had just witnessed. The world kept spinning, but inside me, everything stopped. A man who believes in love and dedicates his life to a relationship never imagines that the knife will come from the very direction he trusts. There was no hesitation, there was no embarrassment. His hand found hers under the table, his fingers slid down to the ring on her left finger, and with mocking delicacy, he removed it before pressing his lips to hers. And she responded. Not with guilt, but with desire. As if it was expected. As if that kiss was the crowning of a planned conquest. I was there, on the other side of the table, being invited to watch my downfall. The first reaction was physical. My arms were shaking, my stomach became a battleground between disgust and despair, and all I could see was the portrait of betrayal stamped on the faces of two people who had until then surrounded me with trust. When she noticed my expression, she slowly moved away from him, as if it were possible to undo what had already been done. But there was no going back. Not after the way he had run his finger over her skin, as if marking his territory. Not after she had made no effort to hide it. Not after his cynical smile, as if he knew that nothing could hurt me more than that. It's not what it looks like, please, not here, she tried to whisper, but her voice was like a blade cutting deeper. What could it look like other than what it was? I was the husband and I was facing the public demolition of my marriage. There was no way to sugarcoat it. It was. Exactly. That. That night, I left quietly. I didn't shout, I didn't make a fuss. I just looked at the two of them and smiled. But inside me, I started to build something. An answer. Not an impulsive or destructive revenge, but a strategic reconstruction, a turnaround that would give me back everything that was taken from me, with interest. Because I wasn't going to allow that kiss to be the end of my story. They thought they had won, but they didn't know they had freed me. And I was willing to go further. Much further. The following days were a mixture of silence and movement. On the outside, I maintained my composure. On the inside, I made plans with the coldness of someone who no longer feels anything. I discovered more than I wanted to about them. I discovered that their relationship had been going on for months. That he, the boss, had used his position to seduce her, but she let herself go because she wanted to. She exchanged messages with him inside our house, planned trips disguised as courses, and smiled at me as if nothing was happening. It was a full-body betrayal, done with the enthusiasm of someone who had allowed herself to forget who she was. But what they didn't know was that I had already begun my transformation. When someone betrays you, you either sink, or you rise. And I decided to rise. I invested in myself, in my skills, in the contacts I had cultivated over the years and who, unlike them, respected me. In secret, I joined a corporate acquisition project. And shortly thereafter, I became the new CEO of the company where they had met. That's right. The same company he had run was now mine. The same company where she worked as a marketing assistant, and where she would now have to call me boss. On my first day as CEO, I walked through the front door, wearing a new suit, a new posture, and eyes that no longer twitched. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Everyone was there, including them. She tried to avoid my eyes, he tried to keep his composure. When I announced changes to the board of directors, the room went silent. And when I read his name on the termination list, his expression froze. But I didn't stop there. I gave him the opportunity to stand up and justify himself in front of everyone, which he did with a forced smile and empty arguments. I didn't address her directly, not yet. There was more. His downfall was swift. An internal investigation revealed dubious agreements, ethical deviations, use of resources for personal purposes, all subtle, but enough to leave him not only fired from the company, but with his reputation dragged through the mud. Without power and without positions, he quickly fell into oblivion. And she, without her powerful lover to support her, tried to survive the scorn of the corridors and the looks that had once admired her. He resigned, of course, before I took any formal action. But the humiliation was already done. She came to me. She tried to talk. She begged for understanding. She said she felt lost, that she had made a mistake, that the love still existed between us, and that maybe we could try again. But there, looking at that woman who was once my wife, I saw only a stranger. A woman who exchanged a story for a moment. Who mistook status for feeling. And who now faced the emptiness she herself created. I didn't take revenge. I just lived. And while she tried to rebuild herself from a world that had collapsed, I continued. It was then that life, in its irony, presented me with something that I had not expected. A new look. A new smile. Someone who didn't know my past, but was enchanted by my present. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was true. And in that new embrace, I found a peace that I didn't even know I could still feel. Different from everything I have experienced before, without promises of eternity, but with the lightness of someone starting over. The funny thing is that, months later, I met my ex-wife again. She had changed. Her eyes were tired, her expression hard. Time was taking its toll. She saw me with my new wife, in a restaurant. The same one where it all began. Her eyes shone for a second, perhaps with regret, perhaps with longing. But it was too late. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. And in that moment, when our eyes met for the last time, I realized that the true triumph was not their downfall, but my rise. And what she never knew, is that everything was much more planned than she imagined. Because that company dinner was no accident. It wasn't a trap that caught me off guard. Maybe, deep down, I already knew. Maybe, I just waited for the right moment to let it all out. Because sometimes, letting the other person underestimate you is the first step to defeating them flawlessly. But what she never imagined, and neither did he, was as I found out everything. Because there was a detail, a subtle movement, a small mistake made right before the kiss, that completely changed the course of the story. Something she never noticed, but that I never forgot. And that's where it all begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support betrayal in any form, on the contrary, we show, through fictional stories, how infidelity destroys lives, erodes trust and leaves deep scars. Each storyline is a warning, a mirror, a painful reminder of the price one pays for wrong choices. Get ready now. What you will hear is shocking, intense and impossible to forget. Good story. Lucas and Amanda were the kind of couple that drew attention in the hallways of the company where they both built their careers. He, a born strategist, was one of the most respected names in the corporation's financial sector. She, with her resourcefulness and charisma, had quickly risen to the position of senior analyst in the marketing department. It was not a cinematic love of the explosive and immediate kind, but rather a slow, steady construction, made of conscious choices and mutual respect. They met during an internal conference, on a coffee break that was supposed to be just another one, but that ended up extending to an improvised dinner, late-night conversations and, eventually, the certainty that they were on the same wavelength. The relationship blossomed slowly, fueled by small kindnesses and the security that only those who mature together are able to offer. After 3 years of dating, they decided to join their lives in a simple marriage, but full of silent promises of loyalty and support. The apartment they soon shared was functional and cozy, with touches of both their personalities. Lucas was organized, methodical, the kind of man who made lists even for things he didn't need and planned even the weekends. Amanda was more impulsive and emotional, but she balanced her spontaneity with an unusual sense of responsibility. The house came to life with the little quirks of each of them, Amanda's favorite cup left on the counter every morning, the economics books piled up on Lucas's desk, the plants she insisted on taking care of even when time was tight, and the soft music at the end of the day to relax after yet another endless meeting. Life went on at a steady pace, sometimes predictable, but deeply welcoming. There was no constant euphoria, but there was complicity, and that, for both of them, always seemed more important than any overwhelming passion. During the first years of their marriage, they developed a peaceful routine. Each had their own career and commitments, but they always returned to the same place at night, where they shared the small achievements and frustrations of the day. Amanda, even dealing with the competitive environment of marketing, maintained her sweetness in the details, preparing Lucas's coffee on the days he left early or leaving notes in his briefcase when she knew the day would be tough. Lucas, in turn, was attentive, observant, and had a discreet but firm way of showing love. He was the kind of man who noticed when Amanda changed the tone of her hair or when something worried her, even if she said everything was fine. It was a marriage made of silent gestures and mutual understanding, where routine was not a burden, but a tacit pact of stability and commitment. The company they worked for was a solid multinational, with branches in several countries and a history of constant expansion. The environment was competitive, but well structured, and there was room for growth for those who knew how to play with intelligence and patience. Lucas, with his years of service and his reputation as a problem solver, was frequently called to meetings with directors and strategic projects. Amanda, on the other hand, had become one of the most influential figures in the internal communications department, often being praised for her sensitivity in dealing with image crises and institutional campaigns. Despite being in different areas, they both frequently bumped into each other at company events, integration meetings and corporate trips, where they shared the same discreet and professional attitude, keeping their personal lives away from the office spotlight. However, there had been something in the air over the past few months. Not an obvious breakup or open conflict, but a kind of uncomfortable silence that sometimes settled between them. Lucas had gotten involved in a new board project, which required him to work late and travel more frequently. Amanda, for her part, had started participating in new internal committees and external events, taking on responsibilities that required her to be present at dinners and conferences. The distance was not only physical, but also emotional, and although there was still the same affection as always, something had changed. Morning good mornings turned into distracted waves, dinners for two turned into quick meals with their eyes on their phones, and the hug before bed was replaced by a simple turn to the side. Still, there were no arguments. No words spoken with resentment, no obvious signs of wear and tear. It was an invisible distance, like a layer of glass that gradually forms between two people. Lucas missed the long conversations of before, but he didn't say so. Amanda noticed his lack of interest, but she avoided thinking about it. They both settled into silence, each waiting for the other to take the initiative to rescue what they were missing. In the eyes of their friends and co-workers, they were the perfect couple, successful, educated, well-matched. But the truth lived in the details. In the lost gaze during breakfast, in the rush to hang up the phone, in the absences that would have been unthinkable before and now seemed normal. Despite this, Lucas still believed it was just a phase. Every marriage, he thought, goes through periods of silence and distance. The routine weighs on them, commitments pile up, and life demands adaptations. He was willing to wait, to give space, to understand. That's why he planned something special for their upcoming wedding anniversary. A short trip, just the two of them, like old times. Not to start over, but to remember. Amanda, on the other hand, was living a roller coaster of emotions. There were times when she felt extremely connected to Lucas, like when she saw him sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the turmoil she carried inside. At other times, she felt out of place, as if she were occupying a life that no longer belonged to her. Their relationship, like many others, was made up of great moments hidden in everyday acts. The way he held the car door for her, even when they were late. The way she fixed his tie before an important meeting. The complicity in their eyes during company events, when an expression was enough to let one know what the other was thinking. But there were also silences. The okay-s that hid hurt feelings, the I'm tired-s that avoided difficult conversations. And, little by little, these silences filled the spaces where there used to be dialogue. Among her colleagues, Amanda was seen as a confident, articulate woman with a natural elegance. She was well-liked, respected and constantly called upon to represent the industry at important events. Lucas, on the other hand, was the respected executive, with a firm stance and strategic intelligence that always placed him in a prominent position. Together, they were admired. Separately, they were discreet. What no one saw was the complexity that lived behind the impeccable image. The undiscussed conflicts, the unexpressed feelings, the insecurities hidden behind smiles and successful presentations. On Sunday nights, the silence between them was deeper. There were no meetings, no deadlines, no goals. Just the shared couch, the television tuned to something neither of them really watched, and the muffled sound of the thoughts echoing inside each of them. It was in this emptiness that the unasked questions lived. Are we still the same? Do we still want the same things? Is love still there, or have we just learned to live with the idea of it? Even without answers, they both continued. Because when you build a life together, there's a lot more at stake than feelings. There are memories, promises, achievements. There is the fear of what comes next, the guilt for what was lost, and the hope, however fragile, that something can be rescued. And maybe it was possible. Maybe there was still time. Perhaps a gesture, a conversation, a reunion would be enough. But what neither of them knew was that the story they were about to experience would change everything. That what seemed like just a phase would turn out to be something much deeper. That what was invisible to the eyes would become impossible to ignore. And that the days to come would be the most intense of their lives. The routine continued with the same serene appearance as always, but something imperceptible had changed in the air around Lucas. He couldn't name it, he could only feel it. It wasn't anger, it wasn't jealousy, or even fear, it was a subtle discomfort, as if a thread was out of place and that was enough to make the whole fabric uncomfortable. Amanda was present, still affectionate in small gestures, but at the same time busier, more involved with the new responsibilities she had taken on after the company's latest restructuring. Now she reported directly to the executive director of marketing, a man Lucas only knew by sight, and who had recently been transferred from the Central American unit to lead the brand's expansion on national soil. He was the kind of man who drew attention, confident posture, striking features, and an eloquence that made any room go silent when he spoke. The connection between him and Amanda grew quickly, with a fluidity that to the eyes of others seemed merely professional. But Lucas, even without proof, began to feel the edges of discomfort tearing at his usual tranquility. The nights began to lengthen. Amanda started coming home later, justifying this with alignment meetings, campaign reviews, and urgent matters that only arise at the end of the workday. Lucas, accustomed to understanding and giving her space, initially just nodded. But, inside, his restlessness grew. Sometimes, he would sit on the couch just to listen to the sound of the door opening, as if her delay were an indirect way of saying something that her lips had yet to say. On a few occasions, he tried to start conversations, suggesting a dinner out, a weekend together. The responses were lukewarm, wrapped in vague promises of, after this delivery, next week, when things calmed down. And he, trying not to be invasive, would back away, but each retreat would widen the distance between them a little more. At the same time, relationships within the company began to change. Lucas, always discreet, noticed glances exchanged, whispers that stopped when he approached, vague comments that left loose ends hanging in the air. There were no accusations, just the kind of silence that weighs more than any words. He began to observe Amanda from afar when they were both at the same corporate events, and realized that something had changed in the way she moved, the way she looked, the way she smiled. It was subtle, but for someone who knew her deeply, like him, it was impossible not to notice. Her smile now came with long pauses between one sentence and another, with a different sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been lit at home for some time. On one of those nights, after a formal company event, Lucas left a few minutes after her, under the pretext of resolving a pending issue with the board. As he left the building, he saw Amanda from afar in front of the director's car. They were alone. They were talking. And then he saw the gesture, quick, precise, intimate. The director touched her face with the back of his fingers, and she didn't flinch. Lucas stopped for a few seconds, but didn't move forward. He walked back the way he had come, without making a sound, without changing his expression. Confirmation wasn't necessary yet, because in that touch was everything he needed to know. In the days that followed, he tried to understand when he had lost his footing. He tried to look for the flaws within himself, the moments when he stopped looking, listening, and being present. He searched his own memory as if searching for a fatal error, a comma out of place, but all he found was the cold truth that he had given himself completely to a marriage that now seemed to be leaning on only one side. Amanda kept arriving late, with the same arguments, with the same confident tone of someone who still believes she is in control. Lucas, in turn, didn't ask. Just watched. And over time, he began to put together a plan, not to confront, not to hurt, but to understand where this was going and what exactly was happening. He began to notice details with surgical attention. The different perfume, the bath times, the sudden mood change on Sunday nights. And then came the invitation to the company's annual dinner, a traditional event that celebrated the year's achievements and where the most influential employees were honored. Amanda seemed excited about the event, talking about the dress, about the prizes that would be awarded, about how important it would be to be there together. Lucas said he would, of course, have a restrained smile and a posture that hid the storm that was brewing inside. On the night of the dinner, everything seemed perfect. The room was lit up, the tables were decorated with sophistication, and the speeches began on time. Amanda was radiant. She wore an elegant, discreet, yet striking dress. Her makeup was precise, and her hair was tied up so lightly that her neck was exposed. Lucas sat next to her, exchanged a few words with his tablemates, and remained silent for most of the ceremony. He observed everything with meticulous attention. When Amanda's name was announced to go up on stage and receive recognition for her work in repositioning the brand, she stood up with a genuine smile and walked to the stage. The director also went up. And there, amidst the flashes and applause, the two exchanged glances that had no place in that context. It was more than professional admiration. It was intimate. Personal. Something was passing there, like a thread of energy that ran through them both and seemed invisible only to those who didn't want to see it. The climax came minutes later. Late in the evening, when some of the guests were already dispersing, Lucas discreetly left the table, under the pretext of an urgent call. He walked towards the bar, but as he passed through the corridors of the adjoining hall, he saw the two of them. Amanda and the director. They were far from the main hall, in a dimly lit corner, near the internal garden. She was smiling. So was he. And then, with the same lightness with which he had touched her face weeks ago, he held her hand, looked into her eyes for several seconds and, in a slow gesture, removed the ring from her finger. Amanda couldn't resist. She remained there, motionless, almost hypnotized. Lucas stopped a few meters away, as if he were glued to the ground. The director held the ring for a moment, then leaned over and kissed her. Long. With an intimacy that needed no other explanation. Amanda returned the kiss. And in that moment, everything Lucas believed about love, about commitment, about fidelity, silently collapsed inside him. He didn't make a sound. He didn't move forward. He didn't shout. He just watched. And inside him, something began to change. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't hate. It was a silent determination. Because in that moment, he understood that he had lost a battle, but not the war. He went back to the dining room, took a deep breath, chatted with one or two colleagues as if nothing had happened, and left before Amanda returned to the table. On the way out, he looked up at the sky and breathed as if he were being reborn. Because what Amanda didn't know, and what that man could never have imagined, was that Lucas had a trump card in his hands. A move that would completely change the chessboard of their lives. A hidden detail, a buried secret, a turning point that was about to emerge from the depths of the silence. And when that happened, there would be no going back. Lucas didn't go to work the next morning. Not because he was devastated, but because he knew it was the right time to act. During the early hours of the morning, his mind constructed each step with clarity and surgical precision. He no longer wanted to understand the whys or try to rescue what was already dead. What he wanted was to take back what was rightfully his, control of his own life. For years, he had built solid relationships, was respected as a leader, and cultivated silent trust among colleagues and executives. He would use all of that now, every thread of reputation, every silent bond, every strategy he had studied in silence. In the morning, he made 3 calls. One to the vice president of the international group that controlled the company. Another to a former mentor who now headed a private investment fund. The third to his trusted lawyer. He didn't need to explain much. Everyone knew that when Lucas called, it was because something big was about to happen. And so began the movement that would change the course of everyone. In the following weeks, Lucas acted discreetly and precisely. While Amanda went about her daily routine between campaigns and meetings, believing that his silence was apathy or perhaps resignation, he was creating a scenario around her that she couldn't see. An acquisition proposal was being put together behind the scenes, and he was the name behind the fund that was moving. The company would be bought, restructured, and the management restructured. Everything was legal. Everything was clean. But with a meticulously planned destiny. The new management group that would take control would, naturally, have the freedom to review contracts, evaluate teams, and appoint new leadership positions. The current marketing director's position? Under review. Amanda's name? Directly linked to him in the internal systems. Everything was ready. Everything was planned. And she, oblivious, just kept floating in that bubble built by her own ego, believing she was on the rise, without realizing that she was heading towards her own abyss. The day of the transition arrived like any other. No one expected the change. The news dropped like a silent bomb at 8 in the morning, when employees arrived and found an email from the global presidency announcing the acquisition of the company and the immediate restructuring. Amanda, surprised, ran to the communications department. The movement was intense. Murmurs, phone calls, doors slamming. And then, the name that no one expected appeared as the new interim CEO until the transition was complete, Lucas. He had taken over. Without scandal, without prior warning. He simply appeared on the main screen of the internal system, with a statement signed and validated by the international shareholders. Amanda could not believe it. Her heart stopped for a second. She took a deep breath, tried to maintain her composure and went to the meeting room where he would be for the first press conference with the sector leaders. He greeted her with the same calm expression as always. A slight nod. Nothing in his eyes revealed what he knew. Amanda tried to smile, but the smile didn't hold. During the meeting, Lucas was firm, objective, explained the changes that would come, and made it clear that all positions would be re-evaluated based on results, attitude, and history of professional conduct. There were no accusations, no indirect remarks. Just a cutting professional coldness, and that hurt more than any emotional confrontation. When everyone left the room, she stayed. She closed the door behind her and walked to his desk. "We need to talk," she said with a trembling voice, trying to sound firm. Lucas watched her for several long seconds before answering. "Yes, we do." And then he stood up, walked around the desk, and stood face to face with her. She began to speak hesitantly, trying to justify her absence, her distance, the pressure of work. She said that everything had been confusing in the last few months, that she herself felt lost, that none of it had been planned. He interrupted her. "Amanda, I'm not here to listen to explanations. I saw everything. That night at the company dinner, the garden, the kiss, the ring. You don't need to tell me what I already know." Her face lost its color. The words simply evaporated from her lips. And the silence was absolute. But Lucas didn't finish. I'm not just telling you that I saw it. I'm showing you what it cost. To him, to you. And to me. Because you may not know, Amanda, but this company now has a new owner. And that owner is me. She took a step back. She looked at him as if she didn't recognize the man in front of her. She tried to react, but he was quicker. You got involved with someone who thought he controlled everything, who used his position to manipulate, to dominate. But what he never knew, and what you also ignored, was that true power was silent, in the hands of those who observe. He was fired today. The letter of dismissal is already on his desk. And you are still under evaluation. The decision will be mine. Amanda began to cry. The tears came without resistance, falling heavily, as if only then had she understood the depth of the abyss she had gotten herself into. She asked for forgiveness. She said it was a mistake. That she had let herself be carried away. That she felt invisible. That she thought Lucas no longer saw her. He listened to everything in silence. Without interrupting. But when she finished, he simply said, I always saw you. The problem is that you never realized how much I was present. Until the day you stopped seeing me too. Amanda tried to get closer, to touch him. But he backed away. Not out of hatred. But out of self-respect. He said that for him, the marriage was over. That there was no going back. That now each of them would go their separate ways. She staggered out of the room. Her face was blotchy, her expression lost. Lucas, on the other hand, remained there, looking out the window, as if he could see the future from that rupture. And it was at that moment that the real secret emerged. Not the kiss. Not the betrayal. But the origin of the plan. Because everything had started long before that night. The acquisition of the company, the contact with the international fund, the silent movements behind the scenes, everything had been planned even before the betrayal had been carried out. Lucas already knew. He didn't just suspect. He already knew. A month before the company dinner, he accidentally found an exchange of messages on Amanda's tablet, forgotten on the couch. There were no passwords, no attempt to hide it. She had carelessly left the conversation open. He read only the last few lines. That was enough. Sweet words, laughter, promises. No direct mention of physical involvement. But the tone was clear. The bond had already been formed. And that day, Lucas didn't confront her. He just started to prepare his response. He went to the gym, had lunch alone, and in the afternoon he had already made the first call to the investor who had tried to convince him years before to enter the world of corporate acquisitions. The plan was born there, not as revenge, but as liberation. He understood that there was nothing to be saved. But there was something to be rebuilt. Himself. Amanda never knew about this. She never knew that, throughout that month, while he smiled and lied, Lucas was building a new universe around him. And when she saw him in that meeting room, announcing the new direction of the company, she thought it was a surprise. But it was just the end of a path that she herself had started. The director. Expelled without the right to defend himself. His career. Ended in silence. The history between them. Reduced to an internal note without fanfare, like everything that doesn't deserve to be remembered. But the most unexpected was yet to come. Because Lucas, when leaving the company that day, with the document signed and the divorce in progress, stopped in front of a cafe. And there, among cups and smiles, he found an old face again. Someone I hadn't seen since college. Someone who smiled with the same brightness as before. And, unlike everything he had experienced recently, that smile hid nothing. It was sincere. Pure. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something real. In the week following Amanda's downfall and the permanent departure of the former director of the company, the corporate environment underwent a silent but intense transition. The leadership was renewed, the corridors lost their air of tension and, at the same time, everyone was filled with hushed curiosity about what had happened behind the scenes. No one commented openly, but everyone knew that something great had happened behind the sudden acquisition. Lucas took over with elegance and dominance, not only as an executive, but as someone who knew exactly what he wanted to build from then on. He did not allow himself to be carried away by petty vanity or the need to prove his victory. It was clear that his motivation went beyond any wounded ego. He wanted to move on. To start over. To close that cycle with the dignity that he himself had preserved when everything seemed to be falling apart. And although his firm and respected presence kept the company's rhythm, there was a part of its history that still needed to be concluded outside those buildings. Amanda did not return to work after the meeting in the conference room. She sent a formal request for leave by email and, a few days later, she officially resigned. She did not say goodbye, did not thank anyone, and did not show up to clean her desk. She simply disappeared. Lucas learned from a colleague that she had moved to another small, remote city, where she had been living with her older sister for a few years. For a while, he avoided thinking about her. He wanted to not carry any grudges, but he was not willing to maintain ties with the past. However, an unexpected phone call changed his course. A voice on the other end of the line, emotional and trembling, identified itself as Amanda's sister. He said that she was ill, not physically, but emotionally devastated, in deep depression, isolated from everything and everyone. And that on several occasions, in the midst of crises and outbursts, she would say his name. He said he didn't know how to help her anymore and that maybe he, even with everything that had happened, was the only person capable of giving some kind of answer that would take her out of that paralysis. Lucas listened in silence. He didn't promise anything. But that night, after finishing all pending reports and turning off the computer screen, he stood for long minutes in front of the window of the new room. He thought about whether it was fair, whether it made sense to touch on that story again. But he understood, with the maturity that time and pain taught him, that sometimes healing a wound requires facing it head-on. And then the following Saturday he traveled to the city where Amanda was. Didn't warn. He just appeared at the gate of the house. The sister recognized him, thanked him silently and led him to the small room in the back, where Amanda spent her days. The room was simple, dark, with the windows half open and the bed unmade. Amanda was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her face down. When he heard the footsteps, he didn't look up. He just mumbled that he didn't need to be there. Lucas approached, sat down next to him, and said that he wasn't there out of obligation, but because he also needed to end it once and for all. The silence between them lasted for minutes that seemed like hours. Then she spoke, her voice hoarse and choked, saying that she had tried to move on, but that the emptiness was greater than any justification. She said that she thought she was building something new, but that deep down she was just running away from her own dissatisfaction. That everything she thought was passion was just a reflection of her own need to be seen. She said that the man she had traded everything for had discarded her as soon as he lost his job, and that for the first time in her life she felt the real weight of being disposable. That all the beautiful words evaporated the moment he realized he could no longer use her to get anywhere. And that was when she understood the value of Lucas's silent presence, his patience, his dedication, the security he offered without having to promise anything. Lucas listened to everything without interrupting. At one point, she got up with difficulty, walked to the dressing table and took a small wooden box out of the drawer. She opened it slowly and revealed something he hadn't expected, clippings of photos of the two of them, old notes, souvenirs from trips, and a letter she had written, never sent. In the letter, she confessed that she knew she had made a mistake even before the mistake had happened. That she had noticed her own absence, her distance, her disinterest, and that even so she hadn't had the courage to ask for help. She preferred to escape into the illusion of something new rather than face the mirror of her own giving up. And that this was destroying her day after day. Lucas read the letter without saying anything. When he finished, he placed the box on the bed and said, in a firm voice, that she forgave him. Not to get back together, not to forget, but because she understood that sometimes forgiveness is the only way to free oneself. They didn't hug each other. They didn't cry together. They did not promise reconciliation. It was just a necessary full stop. Lucas stood up, looked at her one last time, and said he hoped she found a way back to herself. Amanda thanked him, her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long time, she gave a fragile smile, almost imperceptible, but real. He left the house with a light heart, like someone who had finally left behind a weight that no longer belonged to him. He returned to his city and resumed his life. But something inside him had changed. A kind of serenity that only comes after facing one's own ghosts. In the following months, he continued to lead the company, now with new plans, new projects, and much more humane management. He was admired not only for his talent, but for the way he dealt with people. And it was in this context that a new meeting took place. During an international conference, Lucas met Sophia, a Brazilian executive living in Europe, with a remarkable career and a perspective that conveyed exactly what he needed at that moment: truth. Sophia was intense, fun, extremely competent, and had a life story full of nuances. She didn't come to fill voids, but to walk alongside him. And from the beginning, the relationship between the two was marked by a real connection, without games, without impossible promises, but with a reciprocal commitment that grew each day. Lucas, who had relearned to enjoy his own company, was surprised to feel like sharing his days with someone again. And when that happened, it wasn't with fear, but with courage. Months later, at a seaside dinner during a trip with Sophia, he shared his entire story. He talked about marriage, betrayal, turning things around, forgiveness. Sophia listened to everything attentively and respectfully, without judgment, and in the end she simply said that she was proud of the way he had handled everything. And that it wasn't his past that mattered, but what he had done with it. That night, for Lucas, was a milestone. Because for the first time, you felt complete. Not because I'm with someone. But for being whole. For having gone through the worst and found something new on the other side. Life had finally turned around. Without explosions, without Hollywood endings, but with the raw and beautiful truth of someone rebuilding themselves. Amanda continued on her way in silence. She reappeared some time later in an interview about mental health, where she told part of her story without mentioning names. She said that she had lost something precious because she didn't know how to take care of herself. And that today, her mission was to help other people not make the same mistake. Lucas read the article, closed the magazine and smiled. Not out of revenge. But because he knew that, somehow, each pain had found its destination. And that everything he had experienced, even the most bitter, had served to take him exactly where he needed to be. Time went on, but not with the indifferent haste of corporate calendars or busy schedules. It passed at the exact pace that emotional reconstruction required. For Lucas, it was not just about turning the page, but about learning to reread his own story without carrying the weight of pain as if it were a condemnation. The events that had culminated in the definitive breakup of his marriage, the unexpected transformation of his position within the company, and the emergence of a new relationship with Sophia, did not seem disconnected from each other, but rather pieces of a plot that, if it were not real, would seem meticulously scripted. And yet, even after the catharsis, silences remained, remnants of memories that sometimes emerged in banal details, like a scent in the hallway, background music in an elevator, or the muffled sound of heels echoing on smooth marble. There was no active grief, but there was also no complete forgetting, and perhaps there never would be. Sophia understood this complexity as few people could. Instead of demanding absolute presence or proof of a new beginning, she offered space. Her way of loving was mature, respectful, built on the trust of someone who didn't need the other to feel whole. With her, Lucas found lightness, easy laughter, discussions about books, improvised home-cooked dinners, and the rare feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be. But the shadow of the past didn't disappear just with a new presence. It required elaboration, internal review, silent confrontations with everything that had been left behind, with one's own mistakes and those of others. And it was during this phase of emotional decantation that the proposal for a lecture for young executives on corporate ethics and personal resilience arose. Invited by a university, Lucas hesitated to accept. He didn't see himself as an example, and he hated the cult of image. But something about that idea seemed challenging. Talking about values in a scenario where they were often diluted could be a way of extracting meaning from what he had experienced. He accepted the invitation. During the talk, he talked less about numbers and more about choices. He didn't name names, but he described decisions that changed the course of entire lives. He spoke of the pain of losing what one believes to be unshakable. And the power to rise up without needing to humiliate anyone, without making revenge an end, but a bridge to reconstruction. When he finished, there was no frenzied applause, but a respectful silence that said more than any noise. As he was leaving, he was approached by a young man who bluntly asked if what they were saying about him was true. Lucas looked the boy in the eye and replied that the truth, often, is not in what is said, but in what is built after the fall. And he left the place with the conviction that, somehow, his pain had served a purpose beyond himself. A few days later, he received an envelope with no return address on his desk. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was from Amanda. The recognizable handwriting made him take a deep breath before he even started reading it. She said she didn't want to reopen anything, nor ask for a response, nor re-establish ties. She just needed to express something she had never had the courage to say. She said she had watched a part of the talk online, sent by a former colleague at the company, and that for the first time she understood the extent of the impact of her choices. She said she didn't feel like a victim, nor did she want sympathy. She just wanted him to know that she had found meaning in everything they had been through, even though it was painful. That she was getting her life back on track, now with a different attitude, a different outlook. And that, despite everything, she still respected him. Lucas folded the letter carefully, put it in a folder where he kept some personal notes, and didn't reply. Not out of disdain, but because he understood that this was the answer. The lack of a response was, at that moment, the most honest gesture he could offer. Sophia found out about the letter a few days later and didn't mind. She said that the past only weighs heavily when it's still unresolved, and that the most important thing was what he would choose to build from there. This conversation took place on a quiet evening, during a casual but intimate dinner. And it was in this atmosphere that a dilemma began to emerge. A proposal to expand the company was underway, and it would require Lucas to spend long periods of time outside the country. These wouldn't be one-off trips, but rather a trip with no immediate return. A definitive change of scenery. He would have the chance to run the European branch, with autonomy and a direct impact on the group's global structure. It was the opportunity that, years ago, he would have embraced without hesitation. But now there was another equation at play. Sophia, with her own career on the rise, couldn't accompany him at that moment. And although their relationship was strong, they both knew that distance could erode what was still consolidating. The decision was not easy. For the first time, Lucas found himself divided not between two people, but between two versions of himself. The one who, in the past, sought stability and professional recognition above all else, and the new Lucas, more introspective, more attentive to emotions, his intimate life, and true connections. He spent sleepless nights weighing the pros and cons. He avoided discussing the matter with Sophia, not because of a lack of transparency, but because he knew she would support him in any decision, and that made everything even more difficult. At the same time, there was a sense of responsibility towards the project, the team that trusted him, the investors who believed in his leadership. It was not just a personal choice, it was a choice that affected lives. One Sunday morning, during a solitary walk by the lake, Lucas had a thought that disconcerted him. What if all of that, all the pain, all the transformation, had led him to this very point, where the big decision was no longer between right and wrong, but between what he wanted to be from now on. Professional success was no longer foreign to him. Power no longer seduced him. Recognition, as gratifying as it was, no longer defined his identity. And then he understood that his greatest dilemma was another, sacrificing something that could become eternal for an achievement that, although great, could be just one more. Sophia found him that afternoon, sitting on the garden bench where they used to talk at the end of the day. He came over, sat down next to her and, after a few seconds of silence, asked her if she believed that love could withstand time and distance. She replied that love could withstand everything, except the absence of choice. And that if he chose the world, she wouldn't stop him. But if he chose to stay, she would make every second of that choice worthwhile. And that was when Lucas realized, for the first time, he didn't need to beat anyone, conquer anything, prove anything. He just needed to choose. And that choice, as simple as it seemed, carried the weight of everything he had experienced. On Monday, with the contract in hand and the private jet ready to take him to Europe, Lucas entered the boardroom. He sat in front of the group's president, thanked him for his trust, explained the reasons for his decision and calmly and firmly refused the proposal. He said he would continue to lead the local unit, but that his priority now was to maintain the life he had so painstakingly rebuilt. The decision was received with surprise, but also with respect. There was no pressure, no judgment. Just the acceptance that sometimes the real power lies in knowing what you want to preserve. That night, he returned home feeling lighter than ever. He found Sophia reading on the couch, as usual, barefoot and with a peaceful smile. He sat down next to her, took her hand and simply said, "I chose to stay." She said nothing, just closed the book and hugged him. A long, silent hug, full of meanings that dispensed with words. Outside, the world continued at its fast pace. But inside, in that room filled with soft light and the smell of fresh food in the air, time had finally found its place. And all that was left now was to just live, with truth, with lightness and with the certainty that the greatest achievements do not always appear in performance reports, but in the silent choices we make when no one else is looking. Spring arrived with an almost symbolic intensity, as if nature were reflecting in colors and aromas the silent new beginning that Lucas was experiencing in his own life. After deciding to stay, turning down the opportunity for a career abroad, something in him changed, not suddenly, but organically, like a tree that grows silently during the night. He began to indulge in routines that he had previously ignored, long walks with no specific destination, entire afternoons dedicated to books that had no practical use, long conversations with people who were not part of his business strategy. All of this, little by little, began to fill the spaces previously occupied by a life that was confused between ambition and emptiness. Sophia was still by his side, but now with a new intimacy, denser and more serene. It was no longer necessary to talk about everything for them to understand each other, because between them there was a connection built in silence, made of conscious choices and not romantic impulses. She had understood, perhaps even before he did, that true love begins when the desire to stay overcomes the impulse to leave. The company remained stable under his leadership, growing without fanfare, with an organizational culture that was increasingly focused on ethics and well-being. Lucas implemented an internal human development program, something he had always believed was essential, but had never had the courage to propose to his former managers. Meetings began to include breaks for active listening to employees, and strategic decisions were made not only based on profit, but also considering the real impact on people's lives. This brought out talents that had previously been invisible and consolidated a more human, more committed, and closer environment. Many said that he had become a reference for empathetic leadership, but Lucas did not see himself that way. He had simply known the pain of losing everything that he believed to be solid, and for that very reason, he valued every detail of what he had truly rebuilt. It was in this new rhythm that he met Mariana again, a former colleague from the time when he was still just another regular employee, far from leadership positions. She had left the company years before to open a ceramic studio in a nearby village and was now exhibiting some pieces at a design fair that Sophia was curating. Mariana was the opposite of Sophia's intensity, discreet, with calm speech, restrained gestures and a deep gaze. She had a kind of ancestral peace in her eyes, like someone who has faced internal wars and decided not to fight against the world anymore. When he met her again, Lucas felt something he hadn't expected. It wasn't desire or nostalgia, but a strange familiarity, as if he had found an old version of himself that had been forgotten. They talked for hours, laughed about simple things, reminisced about past events and, at one point, she mentioned that she had been discreetly following his journey ever since his and Amanda's story became public after a magazine article. "I didn't want to get in touch before, because I thought you needed silence. And respect." Lucas smiled at the statement. It wasn't common to find someone who knew the difference between giving attention and giving space. From that meeting on, they started seeing each other quite often, but without any hidden intentions. They would have coffee, have occasional lunches, and exchange messages about various subjects. Sophia knew, and never showed any discomfort. In fact, she even invited Mariana to a company charity event. And it was in this unlikely scenario that something began to change, not in the form of emotional triangulation, but as a question mark that slowly grew inside Lucas: was it possible to love two people at the same time in different ways? It wasn't about comparison, nor about substitution. Sophia represented clarity, strength, and a structured new beginning. Mariana, in turn, awakened an almost forgotten introspection, a connection with the purest past, with a version of him that still believed in passions without structure and dreams without a schedule. This doubt began to affect him at unexpected times. One night, watching Sophia sleeping beside him, he felt a sudden tightness in his chest. It wasn't guilt, nor fear, but a rare kind of melancholy, as if he were at a silent fork in the road. He knew he wasn't doing anything wrong, but he also knew his emotions were in contention, even if he didn't want them to be. He avoided thinking too much about the subject, dedicating himself to work and the social projects that were now taking shape inside and outside the company. But it was impossible to ignore the discomfort. The final straw came when Mariana, without prior warning, announced that she would be moving to another country, where she would participate in a 2-year artistic residency. The news caught him off guard. He reacted with enthusiasm and encouragement, but inside he felt an emptiness arise almost instantly. The day before she left, she asked to see him. They met in the studio, a small, cozy space that smelled of clay and wet wood. She made tea, served it delicately, and then, sitting down across from him, said something that sounded like a whisper: "I know you're at peace, but sometimes peace hurts too." Lucas didn't answer. He just lowered his eyes. She continued, "I'm not leaving to run away. I'm leaving because I don't want to become another point of imbalance in the life of someone who has finally found balance. Do you understand me?" He nodded slowly. Mariana smiled, extended her hand, and the touch was brief, firm, sincere. When she got up to leave, he remained seated, listening to the sound of his own thoughts echoing off the walls of the empty studio. On the way home, he found Sophia on the terrace, watering the plants as she did every night. When she saw him, she smiled and asked if he wanted wine or tea. Lucas replied that he just wanted to be there, with her. He sat down next to her, rested his head on her shoulder and, after a long silence, said that he was learning that sometimes the heart can feel more than one thing at the same time and that this does not make any of them less true. Sophia did not ask anything else. She just took his hand, squeezed it tightly and whispered that love is also made of doubts. And that she was not afraid of them, as long as he did not get lost on the way back home. The following days were filled with deep reflection. There were no longer romantic dilemmas at stake, but rather a confrontation with his own identity. Lucas realized that his life was now made up of conscious choices, and that all of them came with consequences. He learned to accept Mariana's absence as part of a cycle that closes without leaving wounds. He learned to value Sophia not as an emotional anchor, but as a real partner, who was by his side not out of necessity, but by mutual decision. And, above all, he learned to forgive himself for the times he loved too much, trusted too much, gave too much of himself, and also for the times he kept everything to himself, thinking he was stronger than he really was. Months later, he received a letter from Mariana, sent from a coastal village where she now lived. The letter was brief, poetic, without demands, without questions. Just one sentence at the end: "Thank you for reminding me that life is not only made up of endings, but of beginnings that we still don't understand." Lucas put the letter away, looked out the window and, for the first time in a long time, felt that he no longer needed to understand everything. Some things just are. And that's enough. The autumn breeze slowly approached, changing the rhythm of the days, bringing with it the feeling that something was closing, as if time were sewing, with silent hands, the last stitches of a story that had been marked by silent pain, improbable new beginnings and choices that defied instinct. Lucas had finally understood that life does not present itself in straight lines, but in abrupt curves and unpredictable crossroads, where each step, even the most hesitant, completely redefines the paths that follow. He no longer needed to prove anything, neither to himself nor to others. He had made peace with what he had been through and, more importantly, he had given a dignified end to what had almost destroyed him. The days with Sophia became less intense and more profound. There was no rush, no pressure, no urgency. Only the awareness that they were building something rare, a love where freedom was not a threat, but the basis for permanence. Amanda's former position, now occupied by another brilliant and discreet professional, was rarely mentioned in the company's hallways. People had learned not to judge directly, but they also knew that certain absences don't need an explanation. Years after leaving, she established herself as a therapist in a coastal city, focusing on cases of women who had been through toxic relationships and situations of emotional abandonment. Her services were discreet, provided with empathy and eyes that had already crossed the darkness. Amanda didn't want visibility or to start over in the spotlight. She just wanted to be useful. Her life had become simple, and this simplicity was now her cure. She didn't keep in touch with Lucas, but in an article published on a mental health website, she mentioned, in an indirect tone, that the greatest liberation of her life had been recognizing the harm she had caused, not only to someone who loved her, but to herself. And that true forgiveness didn't come when the other person said, "I forgive you," but when you finally accepted that you didn't deserve to come back, and yet, you chose to live differently. The former director, on the other hand, had a much less poetic end. After being fired, he tried to regain positions of power in other companies, but the shadow of his conduct preceded him wherever he went. An informal dossier circulated among investor groups, including screenshots, testimonies, and the silent articulation of people who were not willing to go along with his predatory behavior. In less than 2 years, he found himself excluded from boards of directors, rejected in selection processes, and, finally, involved in an investigation into moral harassment and misappropriation of internal funds that was still ongoing in secret. With no space in the corporate world, he disappeared from the radar. No one knew for sure where he was, but some sources mentioned a reclusive, isolated life, trying to open a virtual consultancy that was barely taking off. The lack of prestige, for him, was the greatest punishment. More than any formal conviction, it was oblivion that slowly consumed him. Mariana, in turn, flourished. Her artistic residency became a transformative experience, both for her and for those around her. The works she created there were not about love or loss, but about new beginnings. They were simple pieces, molded with bare hands and her heart exposed. In one of them, she wrote a phrase in bas-relief that would become famous among collectors: "Not every return is physical, but every true separation leaves a presence." Her exhibition gained international recognition, and even though they were physically distant from Lucas, there was a respectful bond between them, made of mutual silence and shared memory. They had not seen each other again since their departure, but they knew that, in some way, they were present in each other's stories, not as open wounds, but as definitive marks of transformation. Lucas, now with a stable emotional life and a daily routine that finally didn't require repairs, dedicated himself to a social project aimed at young leaders who, like him in the past, needed an ethical reference before seeking power. He created a free mentoring platform, where experienced executives shared real stories of failures and new beginnings. He wasn't looking for heroes or formulas for success, but rather to show the human complexity behind every big decision. The project grew, won awards, and became his most significant legacy. Little by little, his public image stopped being associated with the betrayal he had suffered and began to represent resilience, reinvention, and lucidity. Not because he embodied perfection, but because he courageously assumed every nuance of his trajectory. Sophia remained by his side, and one day, during a carefree conversation under the cloudy sky of a cold afternoon, she asked if he was thinking about getting married again. Lucas laughed. Not because he thought it was absurd, but because he never imagined he would hear that question from someone like her, who valued freedom so much. She smiled too, saying it wasn't a request, but just curiosity. And he answered with the calm of someone who has lived long enough to know the value of words. If marrying you means continuing to wake up every day and choosing to be here, then I got married a long time ago. There was no ceremony, no rings exchanged. But that night, he wrote a letter by hand, just like Amanda had done years ago, and gave it to Sophia. In it, he simply said that love, for him, was finally synonymous with peace. And that she had become the home of that peace. Lucas' story was not made into a film or a bestseller. But it spread through corridors, meeting rooms and small cafes where people silently recognized themselves in parts of what he lived. Not as a hero, nor as a martyr. But as an ordinary man, who faced the worst pain anyone can bear, that of being betrayed by the one he loves, and still chose not to destroy what was left of himself. He chose to rebuild. Chose to continue. And with that, he left a legacy that no promotion or position would ever have been able to offer. Comment below what you thought of this story and how it touched you. Your opinion is very important to the channel, and we want to know what you learned from this intense journey. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel now to receive more stories like this, all told with emotion, depth and always with a message at the end. And never forget, cheating is not just a choice, it is a breakup. It destroys trust, disfigures love, and leaves scars that time can soften but never completely erase. There is no justification that can wash away the invisible blood she spills in relationships. The channel does not support or romanticize any type of betrayal. Our goal here is to show, through fiction, how devastating this choice can be. Until the next story.